Okay, good afternoon, 8th grade. This is Mr. Murray coming to you on May 12th at 2 o'clock. Today we have quite a bit to get through. We are going to go over chapters 27 and 28. While chapter 27 is relatively short, chapter 28 is probably the longest chapter in the entire story. It's also probably the most exciting chapter. So I'll get started. After today, the last three chapters are all relatively short, and we should be able to summarize those on Thursday. So that will culminate the remainder of the book. I will have to kind of move through today to make sure we get through 27 and 28 in one session, however. So I'll get started. Chapter 27. So it's October. So when we last left off in chapter 26, school was just starting. So it was the end of August, the beginning of September. Now it's in October, so some time has passed. Most people have forgotten about the trial. The only person who's really still upset about it is Mr. Ewell. If you remember, Atticus suggested that the town would kind of forget about the entire trial and no one would talk about it anymore after a while. He said probably 2 weeks. And he was pretty close. For the most part, the other kids have stopped talking about it. The adults have stopped talking about it. But Mr. Ewell is still upset about it. And he does a few things that let us, as the reader, know he hasn't forgiven Atticus and he hasn't let this go yet. So he was fired from a WPA job. WPA in the 1930s was an organization that the president, Roosevelt, parks, making dams, fixing the roads, things like that, that people who were unemployed could do for employment. Mr. Ewell had one of those jobs, and he loses it for being lazy because he's kind of a drunk, lazy person. Hey, what's going on? I'm just starting to go over chapter 27, so welcome. So I was just mentioning that what Mr. Ewell's been up to since the end of the last chapter. So about a month has passed, well, a couple of months have passed since the trial has ended, and he's still upset with Atticus, and he's still kind of focused on the trial, even though it's over. So we know that he blames Atticus for losing his job through the WPA. He actually claims that Atticus stole his job, which, like everyone knows, isn't true because Atticus already has a job, and no one noticed him working on the roads. So it was kind of just like a noticeable lie that Mr. Ewell made up to blame Atticus for the loss of his job. He also is probably the person who tried to break into Judge Taylor's house. We found out on Sundays Judge Taylor doesn't go to church. Instead, he stays home and reads while his wife's away, and he kind of gets a break from his wife. While he was in his study reading, someone tried to break into his house. He heard the noise, went downstairs, but he apparently scared off the intruder. He's not sure it was Mr. Ewell who was doing that, but it's kind of implied that Mr. Ewell was the only person who was really upset with him. Therefore, it was probably Mr. Ewell who was trying to break in. The reason why he would be upset with the judge, during the trial, the judge made some faces, kind of like to show that like he thought Mr. Ewell was like a liar and kind of beneath him. And if you remember, he did correct Mr. Ewell a few times when he was talking very derogatorily towards people. So Mr. Ewell kind of blames Judge Taylor for how people like lost their respect for him. Not quite as much as he blames Atticus, but he also blames the judge. We also know that Mr. Ewell's been following Helen Robinson and insulting her. So Helen Robinson is the wife of Tom, so she's his widow. Link Dees was the man who stood up in the courtroom and said that Tom was a good person. He had been Tom's employer. He has hired Helen, so kind of like as a way to help her out, he's given her a job tending to his house, stuff like that, doing office work for him, and he's probably the only white person in town who's willing to give her a job. So he's done this like to do a nice thing, and he's found out that Mr. Ewell's been following her and harassing her. So Mr. Link Dees threatens Mr. Ewell and scares him off by saying that he'll have him arrested for harassing Helen. So I want to talk about that a little bit. What I did was I split how Atticus and Link D's handle Mr. Ewell. So both men are trying to cope with Mr. Ewell in the aftermath of this trial. Even though Mr. Ewell's technically won because Tom's been, taken to prison and he was killed trying to escape, almost like he was vindicated, he's still very upset with the people who were part of the trial. So he's upset with Helen because she's the wife of Tom. He's upset with Atticus because Atticus, embarrassed him during the trial. We're not sure if he's upset with Link D's or not, or if he just becomes embroiled with him because Link stands up for Helen. But the way they handle Mr. Ewell is really telling about their personalities. So when Atticus gets spit on by Mr. Ewell, and it's obvious that Mr. Ewell wants some sort of physical altercation, Atticus just ignores him and he hopes that he will leave him alone. Mr. Ewell, aside from spitting on him, he also accused Atticus of causing him his job. So he's instigating Atticus continuously, and Atticus just ignores him, thinking that by ignoring Ewell, he'll just go away. Atticus isn't worried about him at all. He doesn't think he's actually a threat. He thinks he's just kind of like hot air, and I'll talk. On the other hand, Link D's, when he finds out that Helen's being followed, the first time he goes to the Ewell's dump and he yells at them and tells Mr. Ewell to leave her alone. When he finds out that Mr. Ewell does the second time, this time he publicly insults Mr. Ewell, calling him dirty, insinuating that just because Mr. Ewell touched his fence, now he's going to have to paint his fence to get the dirt and grime off of it. And then he threatens to have him arrested, and he brings up a law saying that if a woman feels frightened by a man, that's enough to get the man arrested. After that, Mr. Ewell leaves Helen alone completely, and she has to walk by his house every day to get to work. So that's a pretty good deal, right? Like for Mr. Link D's to scare Mr. Ewell off of Helen. So Link confronts Mr. Ewell, and it scares Mr. Ewell off. Atticus ignores him with the hopes that will cause Mr. Ewell to go away, and we're going to find out in the next chapter that does not exactly work. Last thing to go over, like we said, it's October. The classmates have stopped talking about Atticus, and Alexandria has gone back to her normal self. She's again kind of the top woman around town. She throws these parties. She's in charge. She really likes that. She's socializing with other people. And if you remember way back, she had been kind of in a loveless marriage. So she came here initially to help because of the trial, but now that she has kind of made her way back into Macomb, she's more comfortable here. So she's probably happier here. So it looks like she's just going to stay. So there's no definitive when she's going to leave. It just seems like she's kind of moved in and she's here to stay. And the kids have kind of accepted her by this point, and their interactions between their aunt and the children have improved as well. But aside from Aunt Alexandria being in town, for the most part, things have kind of gone back to the way they were. Now the setup to the next chapter, which is really important. So we found out that in Macomb, on Halloween, it was kind of a thing for the kids to terrorize these two adults who were deaf, two older women. They were from a different part of Alabama, and they had a cellar. And most of the people in Alabama don't have cellars. So the kids decided one Halloween it would be really funny to take all of their furniture from their downstairs and move it into the cellar. Not stealing anything, not hurting anything, just, kids being kids and harassing these two old deaf women. So the policeman figured it out. No one was caught. No one's sure which kids did it. But as a way to keep the children out of trouble, the school and the women in town have decided to set up a pageant during Halloween. So the kids are supposed to dress up in costumes. Scouts class in particular has to dress up in costumes that represent their various agricultural products. And Scout's costume happens to be a ham, so she has to dress up as ham. So if you've seen pictures before online about Scout, a lot of times she's dressed up like a ham. This is why. Scouts hoping that Atticus and her aunt will both come see her at the pageant. But both are tired. We find out that Atticus has been out of town because, if you remember, he's in the state legislature. He's been gone for a week, so he's tired. And his aunt actually helped decorate the school for the pageant. And again, she's older. She's like in her 60s, so she's tired too. So they both decide not to go. So Jem offers to take her to the pageant. It doesn't seem like, if you remember way back, the first day of school when Jem had to be bribed to take her to school. This time he just offers. So he's matured a little bit throughout the story, and he knows his little sister would probably be scared, so he offers to take her, just being a good brother. So this begins a quote from the novel, "Thus began our longest journey together." So gives you a clue that this next chapter is really important. So chapter 28, the best part of the story. All right, there's a little picture of Scout in her costume. Jem's obviously not in a costume because he's a middle schooler, so he thinks he's too old for that. So they walk to the school. On the walk to the school, Jem and Scout have this kind of bizarre conversation where they seem like they're a lot older than they are. They talk about how they used to behave. They used to terrorize Boo Radley. They used to be scared of the hot steams, like in Ghosts and things like that. Kind of just reflecting on their lives, like in a way that adults wouldn't expect young children to talk. As they're heading to the school, they're surprised by Cecil Jacobs. That's one of the kids in Scout's class. He's been mentioned a few times. He was the boy that in chapters past Scout wanted to fight, but didn't fight because of her promise to Atticus. It seems like they've made up at this point. He jumps out and surprises them. They have a little conversation. They congratulate him for scaring them. And he escorts Scout throughout all the various activities at the pageant, freeing Jem up to go hang out with the older kids. So it's just like a very innocent night. They play games, little haunted house type thing, and then they have their pageant. Scout, unfortunately, is dressed up, like we said, as a ham, so her costume's really big and bulky, and while she's in her costume, she figures out that she can sit down if she curls up into it, and she falls asleep. She doesn't wake up for a while, and she actually misses her point to come out. So when she does come out, she's late. It causes a bit of a funny scene. We find out that people in the crowd think it's funny and they laugh. The judge, who was actually at the pageant, breaks out laughing. Everyone in the crowd kind of thinks it's funny, but the teacher is really upset, and she blames Scout for ruining the pageant. That's not a huge deal, as a reader, because the teacher was the one who was very racist and a bit of a hypocrite. So she was kind of like a nasty person anyways. But Scout still takes it personally, and she doesn't want to leave at first. She wants everyone else to leave. That way no one sees her. So Jem, being a good older brother, he tries to console her, and he realizes that she's embarrassed, so he helps her just hang out with her and wait until everyone leaves. Once everyone's basically gone, they start to walk home. They do get a chance to avoid the problem when one of the townspeople offers to give them a ride home. But again, because Scout's so embarrassed, they turn that down. So they walk home, which is what sets up our problem. Another problem with their walk home is Scout decides to stay in her costume, which is really big and bulky. Jem has her dress that she could have changed into at the school, but because she's embarrassed, she liked kind of being locked up in this costume so she could kind of hide her face and her shame from all the people. So she decides to walk home with Jem guiding her. We also find out that it's very dark. The moon's not really out, or visible at least, so it's really dark and it's hard to see, and because of her costume, she can't see well anyways, so Jem has to kind of guide her as they're walking home. On their way home, they hear a lot of noises, and again, because at the beginning of the chapter, Cecil Jacobs jumped out and scared them, they both think Cecil's probably trying to scare them again. Scout says something like Cecil Jacobs, a big fat hen, or something like that, some little kid insult, and there's no reply. Jem also shouts out hello really loud, and again, no reply. Jem and Scout both think this is weird because Cecil's the type who would, not keep a gag going for that long. Once he was caught, he would probably say, yeah, you got me. But he doesn't. So they start walking again, thinking maybe it was just noises in their head, but then they do hear someone. Like, they're both definitely sure someone's following them in the dark. And they can't see, so it's scary. So they continue. Scout's sure it's not Cecil. Jem keeps saying it probably is just Cecil, but even he knows it's not true. He's just trying to keep his sister calm. They can hear, like, feet shuffling behind them. She can hear the, like, swish of his pants, so she thinks it's someone, like, bigger because she can hear the heavy footsteps. So she's assuming it's an adult. And Jem's also definitely scared. They make it to a clearing where there's a large tree, so Jem knows where they are. They're about halfway home at this point. Jem's trying to get a good look at the stranger because when they stop, the stranger stops. And then he orders Scout to run, like, obviously in a panic, trying to protect his sister as he moves to, like, I guess confront whoever's coming towards them. The problem with the attack scene is Scout can't see very well, so when she takes off running, she immediately falls down because she can't really run in the ham costume. And because of the low visibility, she's not sure exactly what's happening. So Scout's unable to see. She falls down. She feels her costume being crushed. Jem helps her up, and they both try to run together, but from behind, someone grabs Jem, and Scout hears a loud crunching sound. Jem screams, and then is silent. Now, if you remember before, like, when the story began, the entire story is a story about that time that Jem's arm was broken. So right here is when that happened. So I know last time we had class, someone mentioned, like, hey, when does he break his arm? Right here, trying to save his little sister from some scary attacker in the dark. The attack continues. Scout runs towards Jem's scream because, again, like, he was pushing her, so he gets pulled backwards and his arm gets snapped. She runs towards him, demonstrating, you know, like, some bravery here because she's running towards whoever just hurt her brother. She bumps into something who she says, like, the stomach is very flabby, so she thinks it's a fat person, but his arms were really strong. So whoever this is grabs a hold of her and starts to squeeze her, almost like squeezing the breath out of her. And her being a fighter, she's kicking and struggling, but she's not able to get away because whoever it is a full-grown adult and way stronger than she is. Suddenly, when it looks like she's in dire danger, someone grabs the stranger from behind and throws him to the ground. Initially, Scout thinks that this has to be Jem, but, like, thinking rationally, there's no way Jem could lift up a full-grown adult and throw him off her. Scout's still having difficulty seeing, but at this point she realizes there has to be 4 people near the tree: herself, Jem, and 2 other strangers. She's not sure who either are, but one of them is definitely hostile. She finds one person under the tree who is apparently unconscious. He has stubble on his face, and he smells of whiskey, and he's not moving. So she moves around because she's, again, not sure if this is the dangerous person or the other person. She can't locate Jem, but she hears someone walking away towards the road, which is coincidentally the way home. So she takes off that way. Again, she can't see very well. She can't move very well because of the costume, plus it's a little crushed. But she wants to go that way to see if that's where Jem's at. Scout manages to follow the stranger and catches a glimpse of him as he walks under a streetlight. She realizes that he's carrying Jem, so she rushes to follow, and as she's following him because of the streetlight, she can see that Jem's arm's dangling in this really bizarre position, like at his elbow, just bending the wrong way. So she's concerned, but the adult's moving way faster than she is, and she's not able to catch up to him. When Scout gets to the house, she's just greeted by chaos. Atticus is shouting for Alexandria to call the doctor. Atticus appears and calls the police as soon as Aunt Alexandria gets off the phone with the doctor. He informs the sheriff that someone's attacked his children. And at this point, Atticus actually says something that he would very much like to meet the person who hurt his son, almost like suggesting he would want revenge, which seems really out of character for him to actually show, like, a bit of anger. But this is the only part in the whole book where he seems to, like, have a flash where he would actually get angry enough to hurt someone. Scout and her aunt have a moment here. Atticus is kind of, like, running around as close to being embroiled in chaos as Atticus is ever in the entire novel, just kind of, like, at his wits. So he goes off to talk to the sheriff, and then he goes back to see Jem. At this point, Scout and her aunt are kind of left alone, and Alexandria has to assure Scout that Jem's not dead. And this is something Scout keeps asking the adults around her, if Jem's dead or if he's going to die. The aunt helps Scout out of her costume, and then she brings her overalls to wear. So remember how the aunt hates when Scout wears boy clothes, and she wants her to wear dresses and act more feminine and grow up to be a lady, even though that's not who Scout is at this point. At this point, when she knows that Scout's really like upset and worried about her brother, and she needs to be comforted, she brings her like overalls and her clothes that she's comfortable in. And she refers to Scout as darling. So I think it's the only time in the entire novel when the aunt doesn't call Scout Jean Louise, and she actually kind of shows her like her human side. Eventually the doctor shows up. Again, this is the 1930s. Doctors back then actually came to your house if you were hurt, especially out in the country. So the doctor arrives. Scout describes how long he spends with Jem as 10 forevers, because again, Scout's 9 years old. The doctor honestly describes Jem's injuries to Scout, so he doesn't try to hide anything from her. He tells her that Jem's arm's broken very badly, probably at the elbow, and he has a nasty bump on his head. He also looks over Scout and sees that she has a nasty bump on her head too. The doctor assures her that Jem won't die, and I think he has to do that like twice before Scout finally accepts the answer. He even jokes that with her for a little bit to try to like ease her mind, take her mind off things. So she's been consoled at this point twice by two different adults, and she's been assured that Jem's not dead. He is unconscious and his arm's very badly broke, and he is hurt because he has a bump on his head, so perhaps a concussion. Then there's a big reveal. Scout goes into Jem's room to check on him. Jem's unconscious, like we said. Atticus and a stranger, which is the man who carried him there, are also in the room. Scout doesn't recognize the stranger, and she assumes he's one of the country folk. She goes more into this assumption because when the sheriff shows up, Atticus brings him a chair, so Atticus and the sheriff are both sitting down, but the stranger doesn't have a chair, and Atticus never offers to get him one. Scout kind of assumes this must be because he's someone from the country, and a lot of the country folk don't seem to be comfortable sitting down in strangers' houses, and she's seen this interaction between Atticus and the country folk before, where they don't like to come inside to conduct business. They like to stand up and remain outside, or if they come inside, remain standing. So she assumes he must just be a country folk. The sheriff arrives. He explains that he already went to the tree. He found Scout's dress, which he was confused by until Scout explains that she had been wearing her costume and Jem had been carrying that for her. He also found some bits of her costume, which also confused the sheriff until Scout explains that, yeah, those are bits of her costume. And he finds a dead Mr. Ewell. He was stabbed with a kitchen knife through his chest. So just lying under the tree, dead with a knife stuck in the middle of his chest. So this would have been the body that Scout bumped into, who she said smelled like whiskey and had stubble on his face. We know now that that was Mr. Ewell, who she noticed under the tree. A couple of really important things, character development for this. We know that Mr. Ewell was dangerous, right? So we talked a little bit last chapter how Mr. Link D's handled Mr. Ewell's threats towards Helen versus how Atticus handled Mr. Ewell's threats towards himself. Now, Mr. Ewell never threatened the children before he did this, so he never made any like threats like, I'm going to get your children. He did make a threat that he was going to get Atticus and he was going to hurt him, but Atticus seemed to assume he meant he was going to hurt him personally, not his children. Also, Atticus didn't think he would really do anything. If you remember, Aunt Alexandria said people like Mr. Ewell would do something in secret. He wouldn't come out in the open and do it. But because Atticus had let Mr. Ewell publicly spit on him and then publicly accuse him of costing him his job, Atticus kind of thinks he gave Mr. Ewell that win he needed, and that would cause him to let things go. But obviously it doesn't. We see a lot of other character development in this chapter. Atticus' response to the attack is to remain fairly calm. He does kind of run around the house a little bit, calling people. He has like a weird display with the sheriff. When the sheriff first shows up, he offers to get him the chair. And the sheriff is like, no, it's okay. Like, he realizes how dangerous the situation is, but Atticus still like gets him a chair. He's trying to remain as proper as possible, trying to hold on to who he is. He does say he would like to see the person who attacked Jim when he's on the phone with the sheriff, suggesting that he would actually think about getting revenge. And that's as close to anger as we see from Atticus in the entire novel. Jem and Scout demonstrate a lot of devotion to each other. Jem escorts Scout to the school. He doesn't need to be bribed to do it like he had been in earlier chapters. He attempts to defend her from a grown man as well, because if you remember, he tells her to run when they're at the tree, and then when she falls down, he helps her up, and he has her in front of him as they're running, so when he gets grabbed, she could keep going. Now, when Jem gets hurt and screams, Scout turns and runs back to him, and then she needs to be constantly reassured by adults that he won't die. The aunt has to promise that he's not going to die, or has to promise that he's not dead, rather. The doctor has to promise that he's not dead, and then again later has to promise that he won't die before she's finally assured. But Scout and Jem both demonstrate this devotion towards one another. And lastly, you see some character development from Aunt Alexandria. She's been very proper, but during the emergency, she consoles Scout. She calls her darling. She gives her her overalls. The aunt can't be described as like a warm person by any stretch, but she is making a good faith attempt at consoling Scout, which is nice to see. And you know, like in the previous chapters, they had been starting to get a little bit closer. Scout had been going to her parties more, so they were starting to kind of like interact with one another on a more personal plane than previous chapters, where Scout just described the aunt as someone who was there. Lastly, questions to leave you with. Why did Mr. Ewell attack the children? What do you think he was trying to accomplish? Do you think he was just trying to scare them, and then perhaps for some reason things went too far? How did he die? We know he smelled of whiskey. Like, did he have to get alcohol in him to become brave enough to attack children? Do you think he thought that perhaps Atticus was with his children? Maybe he thought Jem was Atticus in the dark. We know he smelled like whiskey. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he thought he was trying to hurt Atticus and by mistake attack Jem? Or do you think he's just that awful of a person that he was willing to hurt two children to hurt Atticus? How did he die? Was he stabbed? Was it his knife? Did the stranger bring the knife and stab him? And then who's the stranger? Why was a stranger there in the dark? Like, there's a pretty good hint to this, but I don't want to ruin it for you. But you can probably guess who the stranger is. Scout doesn't recognize the man, but Atticus definitely knows who he is. Atticus doesn't speak to him that we've seen. Remember, the stranger makes it to the house before Scout gets there. So if they had a conversation, that conversation happened before Scout arrives. But Atticus seems to know who he is. He seems to understand his habits. He doesn't offer him a chair, presumably because he knows he won't take it. Why doesn't Scout recognize him? She recognizes almost everyone in town. Is he a country folk? If he was a country folk, why was he in the middle of the woods when the kids were walking? That's for you guys to guess, and I will tell you next class whenever we go over chapters 29, 30, and 31, when his big reveal will come. If you go to the Google Classroom, both of these summaries are there. There's also a quiz over chapters 27 and 28. If you get stuck on any questions, you can go back to both the summaries, and most of the answers, or at least hints to the answers, are in there. There's a video that shows the attack, so I know I went over that really quickly so I could get it done in the half hour that we have together, but the video is only 3 minutes long, and if you want a good visualization of what happened, you're free to watch that. So watch that at your convenience. Take the quiz when you get a chance, and if you need to refer to the summaries, they are there as well. On Thursday, We will go over the last 3 chapters. The last 3 chapters are all short. I think combined, the last 3 chapters aren't even 20 pages. They're probably like 15 pages combining all 3 chapters. So the novel's almost over. We got through the big exciting moment where the children get attacked. We see they stick together during the attack. Remember we had talked in class before about sometimes you need an emergency before a person really reveals who they are. So in an emergency, Aunt Alexandria demonstrates caring towards Scout. In an emergency, Jem and Scout defend one another, or at least try to. In an emergency, whoever the stranger is shows himself to be a good person and saves Jem and Scout. So we'll discuss all that later. I know time is up. I saw that you said goodbye. I will talk to you guys later. Have a good rest of the day. See you Thursday.